The slap landed before anyone could say a word. A sharp crack across a quiet black boy's face, right there in first class. He didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't even move. He just blinked once, slow, stunned, then calmly raised his left wrist and tapped his bracelet 3 times. That was it. No shouting, no threats, just 3 silent taps. 5 minutes later, 61 airlines would lose access to the skies. But no one knew that yet. Tell us where you're watching from, and if you've ever been told you didn't belong in a place you earned. Because this was earned. 12 minutes earlier, boarding was still in progress on flight HN2118 from Geneva to Toronto. Seat 1A was already taken. The boy, about 13, slim, wearing a plain gray hoodie, sat quietly with his headphones in, a small device wrapped around his wrist, blinking softly. His name was Elio Beaumont, though no one had asked. Caroline Baker, lead flight attendant for Halcyon Airways, spotted him as soon as she stepped into the cabin. Her smile was professional, cold, too practiced. She scanned the row and paused at his seat. "Sweetheart," she said, voice just sugary enough to feel like a test. "Are you sure you're supposed to be here?" Elio didn't answer. He hadn't heard her clearly. The ambient noise, his hearing aid calibrating, her tone, all of it blurred. He tapped his bracelet to recenter the audio. Caroline's smile disappeared. "I said, hello?" she snapped, louder now, stepping closer. "First class is for premium passengers. You can't just..." She reached out and, without warning, struck him across the face. A man in 2C dropped his phone. Someone gasped. A tray clattered behind her. Elio looked up, his cheek red, his eyes calm, and then tap, tap, tap. 4,000 miles away, inside the Geneva Ethics Command Center, a red light blinked. Tier 0 override activated, and the skies would never be the same. Caroline froze. She hadn't expected him to cry, but she definitely hadn't expected silence. That quiet, steady stare unnerved her more than shouting ever could. She glanced around the cabin, hoping for a nod of approval, a witness to back her up. But everyone avoided her eyes. Every passenger looked suddenly very interested in their seatbelt, their phone, the ceiling. Anything but her. Elio remained still, his hand resting on the armrest now. The red mark on his cheek hadn't faded, but he didn't flinch. Up in 2C, a silver-haired man in a tailored blazer leaned toward the aisle and narrowed his eyes. He squinted at the blinking band around Elio's wrist, then sat bolt upright. He stood. "Excuse me," he said, loud enough for the front row to hear. "Did you just slap Elio Beaumont?" Caroline blinked. I was just following protocol. He wasn't responding, and The man raised a hand. "That boy's not just any passenger. He's the legal Tier 0 access holder for the Dignity Grid." Someone gasped. Caroline blinked again. What's the Dignity Grid?" The man turned slowly. "The system that governs ESG-based compliance for 61 global airlines, including this one." Caroline's jaw went slack. Another passenger pulled out her phone and started recording. "Elio Beaumont," the man continued, "is the adopted son of Dr. Arielle Beaumont. You didn't just strike a child. You struck the person who holds the final ethics override for this entire consortium." No one moved. The weight of those words hit like turbulence. In the cockpit, a chime sounded. The captain looked down at a flashing message on his console. "Dignity Grid Tier 0 Override. Live." He turned to his co-pilot. "Oh God, we're in it." Back in 1A, Elio finally adjusted his hearing aid, not because he wanted to hear them panic, but because the silence was done. Now the system would speak. 4:17 p.m., Geneva time. Inside a quiet glass building near the lake, 3 analysts at the Universal Travel Ethics Alliance stared at their screens. The red alert had just pulsed once. Not orange, not yellow. Tier 0 override. Verified. Initiator. Elio Beaumont. "This isn't a drill," one of them whispered, already keying in the cross-check protocol. Across the room, a fourth analyst unlocked a secure panel and turned a silver key, activating the auto-freeze cascade. Within 60 seconds, the Dignity Grid began doing what it was designed to do: shut everything down. 14 p.m., Frankfurt. 2 Halcyon flights were paused at the gates. Passengers stood in line, confused as the gate agent's screen flickered and then froze. An error message appeared. Ethics verification failed. Compliance lock engaged. 4:19 p.m., Toronto Pearson. The tarmac crew radioed the tower. "Ground access revoked for HN-coded aircraft." No explanation yet? None, but it's not mechanical. Inside the airport's operations office, a manager stared at a spreadsheet full of zeros. Every funding line flagged. Every ESG clearance pending. "Jesus," she muttered. They pulled the plug. 4:20 p.m., global snapshot. 61 airlines, 118 flights, all tied to ESG-backed capital, all frozen. $3.4 billion in active routes and operating credit, gone cold. The Dignity Grid didn't need a press conference. It didn't need permission. Elio had tapped in, and the system responded. Back on flight HN-218, the cabin lights dimmed slightly as the captain flipped into manual override. He stood just outside the cockpit, looking straight at Caroline. "You might want to take a seat," he said quietly. "Sir?" she asked, her voice cracking. "We're officially in a live Tier 0 ethics incident." She didn't move. He added, "And they're not waiting for our report. They're already watching." Far above the clouds in seat 1A, Elio stared forward. Calm, unreadable, and still silent. But the world around him? It had just stopped moving. Caroline sat stiff in her jump seat, arms locked across her chest, trying to swallow the nausea crawling up her throat. She had faced rude passengers before. She'd been yelled at, ignored, even cursed at. But never, not once, had a child stayed that calm after being hit. Not just calm. Still, it unnerved her. She thought slapping him would shut it down, establish control. She thought he'd cry, maybe scream, maybe call his parents. That would have been easier. But he didn't. He just tapped that sleek little band on his wrist and let the silence do the talking. Across the cabin, Elio sat as if nothing had happened. His hands folded, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular, like he'd already moved on from all of this, and the rest of the world was just playing catch-up. The overhead lights flickered briefly. Caroline's stomach sank deeper. She knew the signal. That flicker wasn't electrical. It was system override, direct from operations. Behind her, a soft ding echoed from the cockpit. She turned just enough to see the captain standing outside the door, his expression unreadable. "Miss Baker," he said evenly, "you'll remain seated until further notice." "What's going on?" she asked, barely above a whisper. The FAA, ESA, and CAA have all been pinged. Flight ethics incident, Tier 0. Command has eyes on us now. Her mouth went dry. "They're watching this flight?" "Live feed. Cabin. Jump seats included." Caroline's hands started to shake. She curled her fingers inward, pressing her palms to her thighs, trying to stop the tremor. She looked across at Elio again. He hadn't glanced her way once. Not since it happened, not even now. That hit harder than any punishment ever could. She tried to justify it to herself. He didn't answer. He wasn't following instructions, but the truth sat in her lap like a dead weight. She hadn't been protecting protocol. She'd been protecting her pride, and now her pride was silent, just like him. 22 minutes into the flight, the cabin was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that pressed into people's chests, the kind that made every sip of champagne feel heavier than usual. Caroline hadn't moved. She sat at the front, buckled in but unraveling. She could feel the judgment. No one was shouting. No one needed to. That made it worse. She looked over, again, at seat 1A. Elio sat there like stone, not angry, not smug, just present, like he was letting the moment marinate, like he knew exactly how much the silence was doing for him. In his lap, a thin, digital notebook lay open. He tapped it once, typed a single sentence, then closed it again. No one saw the words, except him. You don't have to be loud to be heard. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes. Not asleep, just done talking to a world that hadn't listened to begin with. From the galley, the younger flight attendant, Jules, watched everything. He had seen the slap, seen Elio's response, seen Caroline's collapse. Now he stepped forward, slowly, a bottle of water in hand. "Would you like something to drink?" he asked gently. Elio opened his eyes, looked at the bottle, then at Jules. He didn't take it, just gave a soft shake of the head. No malice, just no interest. Jules nodded and stepped away. 2 rows behind, a woman whispered to her husband, "I think that boy just grounded the world." He didn't reply, because they all felt it. Something was shifting, and not just in the air. Back in the cockpit, the captain received another encrypted message. He read it once, exhaled, and muttered, "We're not flying solo anymore." In seat 1A, Elio reopened his notebook and added one more line. They thought silence was weakness, but silence has reach. 4,000 miles away, in a quiet glass office above Lake Geneva, Dr. Arielle Beaumont was in the middle of a meeting when her assistant burst through the door. "Ma'am, it's live." Arielle didn't ask what. She already knew. She stood, walked to the console mounted near the window, and tapped her fingerprint against the screen. The alert was waiting. Dignity grid. Tier 0 override activated initiator, Elio Beaumont. Location, flight HN218. Her shoulders tensed, not from panic, but from purpose. "Pull full system access," she ordered. "Lock all ESG ties to Halcyon-linked carriers, and prep a Tier 1 advisory for the World Transport Alliance." The assistant hesitated. "Should I notify Elio?" Arielle paused. "No. If he triggered it, he already knows what comes next." She turned back to her desk and unlocked a drawer. Inside was a black folder labeled Flight Dignity Charter, Draft 3.1. She'd been holding it back, waiting for the industry to catch up, waiting for one final tipping point. She never imagined it would be her son. In Washington, D.C., inside the WTA command floor, a line of lights blinked across the global air traffic map. One by one, red markers flared over Toronto, Frankfurt, Singapore, São Paulo. An analyst whispered, "It's a cascade." Another tapped their headset. "Ma'am, we've just confirmed the Tier 0 source." It came from a child. "What child?" the director asked. "Elio Beaumont." The room went still. Everyone in international aviation knew the name Arielle Beaumont, architect of the Dignity Grid, former ethics lead at the European Transport Commission. But most didn't know she had a son. Now they did. And he had just pulled the lever no one else dared touch. Back in Geneva, Arielle stepped onto the balcony, eyes fixed on the Alps beyond the lake. She didn't smile, but under her breath, she said, "It's time." By the time the plane crossed into Canadian airspace, the world had already changed. The Dignity Grid, a system quietly tested for years, never activated at scale, was no longer a pilot program. It was live, autonomous, and moving faster than most governments could react. Inside the control room of the World Transport Alliance in D.C., red lights blinked like a heart attack across the screen. Singapore, Delhi, Munich, Sao Paulo, Johannesburg. Every Halcyon-linked carrier was being stripped of access. An executive officer leaned over the shoulder of a young analyst. "This wasn't supposed to be possible without committee approval," the analyst replied, eyes glued to the screen. It wasn't, unless a Tier 0 was triggered by the verified primary. The officer straightened up slowly. You mean Arielle? No, sir. Her son. 8:43 a.m. EST. WTA pushes global advisory. The WTA issued a rare Level 1 directive sent to 27 transport ministries, 61 airlines, and 11 investment banks in less than 8 minutes. The message was clear. Failure to comply with the Passenger Dignity Charter will result in the immediate suspension of ESG-backed funding, international routing rights, and compliance certification under the Dignity Grid system. The advisory ended with one line bolded in red, triggered by Elio Beaumont, Tier 0 Ethics Node. 10:02 a.m. Halcyon HQ. Manhattan CEO Lydia Kessler stared at the bulletin on her tablet. Around her, the Halcyon board of directors sat frozen. Not a single one dared to speak. It wasn't just the funding freeze. It wasn't just the blocked routes. It was the optics. A quiet black boy in first class had been slapped, and the entire system chose him over them. One board member broke the silence. "Can we dispute the override?" Lydia answered, almost to herself. "You can't dispute math? The grid isn't emotional." Another muttered, "It's going to be a PR nightmare." Lydia snapped, "It's not PR, it's ethics, and they just made it law." 11:28 a.m. Geneva. Arielle Beaumont watched the headlines scroll across global networks. Dignity Grid override freezes 3.4B in airline capital. FAA and ESA to meet for emergency alignment. Child activates global compliance system. She didn't call Elio. She didn't need to. Instead, she called a name she hadn't spoken in years. Soraya Fields. "Connect me." Her assistant blinked. "The final regulator?" Arielle nodded. She's the only one who can push the Accord global. Meanwhile, on flight HN2118, Caroline remained in her jump seat, staring forward. Every part of her career was unraveling, and yet no one had fired her. They didn't need to. That boy, he hadn't screamed. He hadn't cursed. He had let the world do the talking for him. And now the world was listening. Elio opened his notebook again. He wrote slowly, precisely. "You can't train for dignity. You choose it. And when others don't, systems must." The flight continued as scheduled. But nothing else was on schedule anymore. The wheels of flight HN2118 touched down at Pearson International with a hush that didn't match the chaos it had unleashed. No sirens, no press. Just a long, slow taxi to the private gate. Gate 9, now roped off, guarded, and sealed by international directive. As the plane rolled to a stop, the captain's voice came over the intercom. Calm, but unmistakably different. "Ladies and gentlemen, we thank you for your patience. A Dignity Protocol landing has been completed. For those disembarking, please remain seated. A security team will escort select individuals off the aircraft per Tier 0 guidelines." The air inside the cabin shifted. Some passengers craned their necks. Others simply stared ahead, like they just witnessed something far bigger than a flight delay. In seat 1A, Elio Beaumont slowly gathered his small tablet and notebook. He didn't stand right away. He waited until the crew moved aside, until the captain came out and gave him a single respectful nod. Then he rose. On the tarmac, 3 international ethics officers stood outside the jet bridge. No flashbulbs, no reporters. But every major airline executive, transport minister, and ethics regulator in the world was watching via encrypted stream. The moment the cabin door opened and Elio appeared, they stood. From Seoul to Brussels, from Sao Paulo to Chicago, every person with power in the industry rose to their feet. Not for fear, not even for justice, but for a truth that had been ignored too long. Dignity doesn't come from power. It demands it. Inside the press room, Geneva Dr. Arielle Beaumont stepped up to the podium, flanked by leaders from WTA, ECA, and the Ethics Federation. She didn't hold a speech. She didn't need one. Instead, she spoke with quiet fire. What happened on flight HN218 was not a mistake. It was a mirror. One boy, silent, did what decades of policy failed to do. He reminded the system that human dignity is not optional. She held up a document titled The Passenger Dignity Accord, then looked straight into the camera. As of today, all global aviation partners operating under ESG or sovereign funding will be required to sign this accord. Those who don't will lose clearance under the dignity grid. There will be no exceptions. Outside the terminal, Elio stepped into the open air. Not a single camera rolled. That was the point. This wasn't about going viral. This wasn't spectacle. This was reconstruction. A representative from the Canadian Ethics Authority offered him a respectful bow. No questions, no fuss, just recognition. Next to them, Jules, the younger flight attendant, stood silently. He didn't try to apologize. He didn't grovel. He just looked at Elio and whispered, "Thank you." Elio nodded once, then walked away. Not toward the car waiting for him, but toward his mother, standing alone at the edge of the curb, hands folded, eyes full. Arielle didn't run. She didn't rush him. When they met, she simply placed her palm against the side of his face and said, "You didn't need to speak. You reminded the world how to listen." Later that evening, global news ticker. Dignity Accord signed by 42 countries within hours of announcement. 4 CEOs stepping down following ESG ethics breach. Beaumont family becomes symbol of quiet power and systemic dignity reform. Elio sat on a hotel balcony that night, notebook open, pen in hand. One final line. Sometimes, the quietest boy in the room carries the loudest consequence, too. 72 hours later, the airline industry wasn't just adjusting, it was scrambling. 4 major airlines had already announced internal ethics audits. 2 airports suspended partnerships with carriers who refused to sign the Dignity Accord, and ESG investors were pulling out of any airline flagged non-compliant by the grid. A quiet storm had become a full-blown correction. Inside a boardroom in Atlanta, one executive slammed a folder shut. This kid, this Elio, just tanked 6 months of negotiations with Zurich and Abu Dhabi. Across the room, the chief risk officer replied coldly, "No, we did. He just turned on the lights." In Geneva, Elio's name trended for days, but he never spoke. No interviews, no public photos, no staged reunions. When a major morning show offered a 6-figure sum for an exclusive segment, Arielle responded with a single text. Silence was the statement. "We're not diluting it now." WTA invited Elio to appear at the next ethics summit. He declined. Instead, he mailed a handwritten quote, now printed and framed in the lobby of the World Transport Alliance. "Power isn't what you show, it's what you change." Back on the ground, Caroline resigned quietly. No lawsuits, no counters, just a one-line email. "I was wrong, and I won't be part of a system that doesn't listen." Surprisingly, Elio never asked for disciplinary action against her. He didn't have to. The system answered for him. In a quiet park in Geneva, Elio sat by the lake with his headphones in. Jules, the young attendant, approached carefully. "Still not talking to the world?" Elio glanced at him, then looked back at the water. "Not yet," he said. "They're still talking over each other. I'll wait." Jules smiled. "Take your time. We're finally listening." 3 weeks later, the world didn't remember the slap. It remembered what came after. Airlines rewrote their ethics codes. Airports installed non-verbal reporting systems, and over a dozen governments passed emergency compliance laws. But none of them mattered more than one document. In Brussels, under a vaulted ceiling of the Global Ethics Assembly, 42 nations came together to sign something unprecedented. The Elio Beaumont Aviation Integrity Act, a binding global charter, named not for a hero who fought or shouted, but for a boy who said nothing. In Geneva, Elio didn't attend. He watched the live stream from his window. Arielle stood at the podium in his place. "Elio never asked for revenge," she said. He asked for accountability without spectacle. She turned to the flags behind her. And today, you proved it's possible. No applause, just quiet nods. That was the tone Elio set, and the world followed. In classrooms and boardrooms, Elio's quote appeared in places no one expected. On the wall of a Tokyo ethics training center, in a textbook on corporate accountability at Columbia, etched into a glass plaque inside a first-class lounge in Qatar. Dignity is not a privilege you earn. It's a standard you protect. Back in Geneva, park bench, same lake. Elio sat beside his mother. She handed him a small envelope. Inside, a letter from the head of the WTA. We're funding an institute in your name, not for you to run, just to keep your question alive. Elio raised a brow. What question? Arielle smiled gently. The one you didn't ask, but the world had to answer. What happens when a system humiliates the wrong person? Later that night, Elio wrote quietly in his notebook by the window. This time, he wasn't writing for himself. He was writing for the next kid. The quiet one. The one the world thinks doesn't notice. Don't wait to be loud to matter. Learn what lever to pull, then pull it. One truth can rewrote the whole sky. He closed the notebook and looked up at the stars. Planes were still flying. The world was still moving. But something had shifted in its orbit. Final headlines of the Season 4 global airlines restructure around ethics compliance. Dignity Accord becomes global standard. Flight attendant who sparked global reform speaks, I deserve to be fired. The quietest boy in the sky changed how we fly forever. In the end, Elio didn't become a celebrity. He became something harder to erase. A reference point. Dear passenger, I wasn't special. I was just first. You'll board flights someday. You'll see injustice happen, maybe to you, maybe to someone else. When you do, don't yell, don't fight. Know what system you're in, know how it runs, and know what string to pull. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is remain calm long enough for the system to reveal itself. Then make it answer. It started quietly. A gate agent in Atlanta refused to bump a child traveling alone. A flight attendant in Frankfurt reported a colleague's discriminatory comment and was promoted instead of punished. An airline in Nairobi replaced its first-class training with passenger dignity labs. No headlines, no hashtags, just a quiet shift. One decision at a time. The Elio effect, they started calling it, at a leadership summit in Singapore. A panelist quoted Elio's line again, "Don't wait to be loud to matter." The room went still. For the first time, executives weren't focused on optics, but impact. How are we measuring ethical behavior in real time? One CEO asked. How are we designing consequences that restore, not just punish? Another followed. The questions were changing, because the world had already seen the answer. Back in Geneva, Elio turned down a private scholarship. Instead, he asked for something else. Fund 5 students from places where quiet kids get ignored. It wasn't charity. It was pattern correction. Meanwhile, at Halcyon Airlines, the company didn't die. It restructured. Caroline's resignation triggered a full board review. Jules became head of cabin ethics training, and Lydia Kessler, the CEO, announced a company-wide reset. We didn't lose because a boy spoke out. We lost because we forgot what silence can reveal. Arielle. Watching it all. She never said, "I told you so." But at a dinner with transport ministers, one leaned over and whispered, "Your son did more in silence than we did in a decade." Arielle smiled. "He didn't change the world," she said. "He reminded it of the standard it pretended to forget." Months passed. The world didn't stay still. News cycles moved on. Airports filled again. Airlines resumed business. But something fundamental had shifted. Not because a new law was passed, not because someone went viral, but because the system had been seen. And once you see the cracks, you can't pretend they aren't there. At the World Aviation Congress, someone on the panel asked the question everyone had been thinking but hadn't dared say out loud. Was Elio just a moment? The room went still. Arielle Beaumont leaned forward in her seat, her tone calm but clear. "He wasn't the point," she said. "He was just the first undeniable one." The shift wasn't just in conversation. It was in structure. Airports across the world quietly integrated dignity access pods, small private stations where passengers could submit discrimination reports anonymously. Some were soundproof. Others had built-in translation and accessibility tools. Most importantly, they were designed to be used before the damage was done. Flight attendant training now included real-world scenarios based on Elio's incident. Not dramatized, not sanitized, unflinching. One airline rebranded entirely. Their new slogan, silent, seen, safe. In a small school in Ghana, a teacher held up a new textbook titled The Beaumont Standard. "Today's lesson," she said, "isn't about rules. It's about what holds the rules accountable." The children didn't know Elio personally, but they got it. They understood what it meant to be dismissed for being quiet, and what it meant to find power, not by shouting, but by being unshakable. Meanwhile, Elio kept walking home from school like nothing happened. Same route, same backpack, same noise-canceling headphones. But the world was different around him. Not louder, just more alert. Quiet kids started speaking, not with noise, but with clarity. Loud people started listening, not for rebuttal, but to understand. Inside every ethics boardroom from Boston to Berlin, one phrase began to show up on walls. Dignity is not a trend. It's the foundation. Ignore it, and you'll be replaced by those who don't. It wasn't a threat. It was truth. Back in Geneva, Elio sat on the balcony with his notebook. He didn't write for a post, or a headline, or a speech. He just wrote, "What we call silence isn't empty. It's full of the things people never gave us space to say. I didn't change the world, but I didn't let it silence me either. That is enough." And now we want to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed someone being mistreated simply because they were quiet, young, or underestimated? Tell us your story in the comments. Not the loudest one, the one that stuck with you, the one that made you pause and think, that wasn't right, and something should have been done. Because sometimes, the smallest voices leave the biggest mark. Drop your thoughts below. Let's build a space where dignity is the standard, not the exception. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who still believes silence means weakness. We know better now. This is Telltales, and stories like these deserve to be told.